This is Father Time from Happy Go Lucky by David Sedaris, published in 2022. Father Time. The night before his 95th birthday party, my father fell while turning around in his kitchen. My sister Lisa and her husband Bob dropped by hours later to hook up his new TV and discovered him on the floor, disoriented and in pain. He fell again after they righted him, so an ambulance was called. At the hospital, they met up with our sister Gretchen and with Amy, who'd just flown in from New York to attend the party, which was now canceled. "It was really weird," she said when we spoke on the phone the following morning. "Dad thought Lisa was Mom, and when the doctor asked him where he was, he answered Syracuse, where he went to college. Then he got mad and said, 'You're sure asking a lot of questions.' As if that's not normal for a doctor. I think he thought this was just some guy he was talking to." Fortunately, he was lucid again by the following afternoon. That was the hard part for everyone, seeing him so confused. On the night that my father fell, I was in Princeton, New Jersey, the fourth of 80 cities I would be traveling to for work. On the morning he was moved from the hospital to a rehabilitation center, I was on my way to Ann Arbor. Over the next week, he had a few little strokes, the sort people don't notice right away. One affected his peripheral vision, and another his short-term memory. He'd wanted to return home after leaving rehab, but by this point there was no way he could continue to live alone. I'm not sure where I was when my father moved into his assisted living center, Springmore, it's called. I saw it finally, 4 months after his fall, when Hugh and I flew to North Carolina. It was early August, and we arrived to find him in an easy chair, blood flowing from his ear at what seemed to me a pretty alarming rate. It looked fake, like beet juice, and was being dabbed at by a nurse's assistant. "Oh, hello," my father said, his voice soft and weary sounding. I thought he didn't know who I was, but then he added my name and held out his hand. "David." He looked behind me. "Hugh." Someone had wrapped his head with gauze, and when he leaned back he resembled the late English poet Edith Sitwell, very distinguished looking, almost imperious. His eyebrows were thin and barely perceptible. It was the same with his lashes. I guess that, like the hairs on his arms and legs, they just got tired of holding on. "So what happened?" I asked, though I already knew. Lisa had told me that morning on the phone that the grandfather clock he'd brought to Springmore had fallen on him. It was made of walnut and bronze and had an abstract human face on it, surrounded by numbers that were tilted at odd angles. My mother always referred to it as Mr. Creech, after the artist who made it, but my dad calls it Father Time. I'd said to Hugh, after hanging up with Lisa, "When you're 95 and Father Time literally knocks you to the ground, don't you think he's maybe trying to tell you something?" "He insisted on moving it himself," the woman attempting to staunch the bleeding said, "and it cut his ear. We sent him to the hospital for stitches, but now it's started up again, maybe because he's on blood thinners, so we've called an ambulance." She turned to my father and raised her voice. "Haven't we, Lou? Haven't we called an ambulance?" At that moment, 2 EMTs bounded in, both young and bearded like lumberjacks. Each took an elbow and helped my father to stand. "Are we going somewhere?" he said. "Back to the hospital," the woman shouted. "All right," my father said. "Okay." They wheeled him out, and the woman explained that, while the staff would remove the blood stains from the carpet, It was the family's job to get them off any privately owned furniture. "I can bring you some towels," she suggested. A few minutes later, another aide walked into the room. "Excuse me," she said, "but are you the famous son?" "I'm a pretty sorry excuse for famous," I told her, "but yes, I'm his son." "So you're Dave Chappelle. Can I have your autograph? Actually, can I have two?" Sure," I said. I just joined Hugh in cleaning the easy chair when the woman, who seemed slightly nervous, the way you would be around a world-famous comedian who is young and black and has his whole life ahead of him, returned for two more autographs. "I'm the worst son in the world," I told her, reaching for the scraps of paper she was holding out. "My father fell on April 7th, and this is the first time I've visited, the first time I've talked to him even." "You put yourself down too much," the woman said. "Just pick up the phone every so often. That's what I do with my mother." She offered a forgiving smile. "You can make that second autograph to my supervisor," and she gave me a name. The blood on our wet rags looked even faker than the blood I'd watched falling from my father's ear. I took a few half-hearted swipes at the easy chair, but it was Hugh who did most of the work. Mainly I looked at the things my dad had decorated his room with. Father Time, a number of the streetscapes he and my mother bought in the 70s, rocks he'd carried back from fishing trips, each with a date and the name of the river it had come from written on it. All of it was so depressing to me. Then again, even a unicorn would have looked dingy in this place. I don't know if it was the lighting or the height of the ceiling. Perhaps it was the hospital bed against the wall, or the floor-length curtains that looked as if they'd come from a funeral parlor. Down the hall, a dozen or so residents, most in wheelchairs and some drooling into bibs, were watching MASH on television. I couldn't help but think of Mayview, the nursing home my father put his mother in, back in the mid-70s. It seemed like only yesterday that I had gone with him to see her. If now, here I was, visiting him in a similar place, wouldn't it be me in the blink of an eye in my own assisted living center, me, the frail widower reduced to a single room? Only I wouldn't have children to look after me, the way my father had Lisa, who had been extraordinary, and my brother Paul, and Amy and Gretchen. My sister-in-law, Kathy, had outdone everyone, stopping by sometimes twice a day, taking Dad to lunch, rubbing lotion onto his feet. I was the only exception. Me, Dave Chappelle. "Do you think we can get a few pictures together?" one of the nurses asked on my way out. "Oh, wait, I want one too," another woman said, and another after her. "Look," I imagined them telling people afterward, "I got a photo of me with Dave Chappelle." "No, you didn't," they'd be told. Of course, I'd be long gone by then, like always. Hugh and I drove to our house on Emerald Isle, the C section, after leaving Springmore, and were joined a few days later by his older brother, John, who'd brought two boys, his 7-year-old grandson, Harrison, and Harrison's half-brother, Austin, who was 11. All three live in a small town on a strait several hours west of Seattle. The kids had never encountered water they could walk into without shrieking from the cold. They'd never seen fine sand or pelicans. I thought they'd be thrilled, but it was hard luring them away from the portable gaming console they'd brought from Washington, a Nintendo Switch. "What?" Harrison cried, exasperated, after touring the house. "You don't have a TV we can hook this up to?" He was one of those children who'd skipped cute and gone straight to handsome. I suppose this could change over the next few decades. His nose might grow out of proportion to the rest of his face. He could lose his chin or a cheek in some sort of accident. But even then he'd have his eyes, which were cornflower blue, and a pouty, almost feminine mouth, the lower lip slightly larger than the top one. Everywhere he went, he was the best-looking person in the room. Does he realize it? I wondered. Kids his age are usually oblivious. Looks aside, Harrison and his half-brother, both of whom live with their mother, were far from spoiled. Nintendo was something John had given them earlier that year. They weren't allowed one at home, and after a few hours I could understand why. The console was the first thing they'd reach for in the morning, and the last thing they'd look at before going to bed, which on most nights was well after 1 a.m. The boys didn't seem to have any rules, the way I did, when I was their age. "You can't just leave the table," I said to Harrison on the first night of his visit, when he finished his dinner and ran off to play Minecraft. "You have to ask if you can be excused." "No, I don't." "No, I don't, Mr. Sedaris." I made the boys call me that, and would correct them whenever they slipped up. "I'm an adult, and you're guests in my house." "It's not your house, it's Hugh's," Harrison said. Hugh looked up from his plate. "He's right, look at the deed. This place is in my name." "Yes, well, I bought it," I said. Harrison rolled his eyes. "Yeah, right." The following afternoon I came down from my desk and found him and his half-brother on the sofa, gaming again. "Why don't you put the Nintendo away and write a letter to your mother?" Harrison nudged Austin in the ribs. "Stranger danger." This apparently was something they'd learned in school. Don't talk to him. "I'm not a stranger, I'm your host, and it wouldn't hurt you to be a little more like me for a change." "What's so good about you?" Harrison asked. Two things," I said, my mind racing as I tried to think of something. "I'm rich and I'm famous." He shook his head, his eyes locked on his game. "I don't believe a word you say." "Hugh," I called, "will you tell Harrison I'm rich and famous?" "I think he's out on the beach," Alston said. His eyes glowed like his half-brother's on the paperback-sized console they were sharing. "What did you do to get famous?" "Wrote books," I said. "Well, I never heard of any of them," Harrison told me. "That's because you're 7, I said, more hurt than I care to admit. "Grown-ups know who I am, especially nurses." Later that afternoon, for the fourth time that week, Hugh saw someone taking pictures of our house. "I think they read your last book," he said. "See!" I shouted to Harrison in the next room. He was into his game and didn't answer. "They're most likely just taking pictures of the C-section sign," I said to Hugh. "It is a pretty good name for a beach house." I then told him about a place our neighbor Burmy had mentioned that was farther up the coast and was called You Didn't Get This Bitch. "That probably gets photographed as well," I said, "especially by divorced men." The picture-taking on the street side of our house was nothing compared to what was going on out back. When I was young, sea turtles would lay their eggs on the beach, and no one thought much about it. Now, though, it's a huge deal. Loggerheads are on bumper stickers and signs. They're an attraction, like the wild horses near Ocracoke. The spot where the eggs are laid is marked, and when the time arrives for them to hatch, a team of volunteers from the Turtle Patrol is dispatched. A bright yellow stake had been driven into the sand near the foot of the wooden staircase that led from our house to the beach, and in the morning, after the boys arrived, volunteers dug a trench that would make it easier for the hatchlings to find the ocean. Now it was lined on either side with folding chairs and the Turtle Patrol nest-sitting. I said to Hugh, "It's like the red carpet at the Academy Awards." People walking down the beach, seeing the yellow caution tape and the trench monitored by do-gooders in bright Turtle Patrol t-shirts, wandered over to ask questions, and the crowd grew. At night they'd sit with infrared flashlights, intently staring down, watching for the slightest movement, with their cameras at the ready. It's actually called a boil, Kathy told me. That's because when the eggs hatch and the babies claw their way to the surface, the sand churns. Isn't that exciting? I said to the boys. Uh-huh, they answered, sure. Really, I said, you're not interested in nature. When I was their age, it was pretty much all I cared about. That and stealing and spying on people. I told them about the hideous-looking silver possum who'd climbed up the front stairs of the house last Thanksgiving. We fed her fruit and leftovers, and you should have seen the way her hands grabbed the food, almost like a human, every night she came. Austin, politely but vacantly, said, "Wow." The only way to get the boys' attention was by throwing one of the stink bombs I'd bought a week earlier on Cape Cod. I'd thought the smell would be negligible, maybe like an old sock, but instead it cleared not just the room where the boys were playing Mario Kart, but an entire side of the house. It was sulfur for the most part, what I imagine Satan's bathroom would smell like after he'd been on the toilet with the National Review for a while. "God damn it," Hugh said, holding his nose and opening the front and back doors, letting the hot, humid air in. "And we have company coming." "Why, you book writer," Harrison scolded. He was wearing Minecraft pajamas and looked like a male model who'd been put into a machine and made small. Of the two brothers, Austin had the sweeter temperament. He'd ask questions and offer to help out. His voice had an old-fashioned quality to it, like a boy's in a radio serial. "Gee willikers," you could imagine him saying, if that were the name of a video game in which things blew up and women got shot in the back of the head. Compared to other kids I've known, the two were actually pretty good. Both liked fish, and they always ate everything on their plates. Rarely did they bicker, and when they did, it was over within a minute or two. There was no crying, and, better still, no sulking. That to me is unbearable. "Oh, move on, for God's sake," my mother used to say when we glared and stewed, vowing to never forget the injustice of egg salad or potato chips that were from the bottom of the bag and broken. The boys weren't terribly interested in the boil taking place in the back of the house, but I thought they might change their minds if they saw the baby loggerheads. The eggs were the size of ping-pong balls and were supposed to hatch on Monday, then Tuesday, then Wednesday. At night we'd walk to the top of our stairway and see if there was any action. "Aren't we lucky to have a front row seat?" I'd say. "If you say so," Harrison would answer. My 15-year-old niece, Maddie, had the same attitude. She was at the beach as well, though you'd hardly know it. We'd see her briefly at lunch and dinner, but the rest of her time was spent in seclusion, her face 6 inches from her phone. Was there an equivalent thing when I was young? I wondered. I don't recall my parents crying, "You and that goddamn transistor radio." The boys slept in what we'd come to think of as my father's room. It was strange being at the beach without him, but we didn't yet have the proper equipment, a walk-in shower, bars beside the toilet, and so on. A year earlier he hadn't needed those things, but that's the difference between 94 and 95. The day before his fall, he'd driven to the gym, not knowing that it would be the last time behind the wheel of a car, his last night in his own bed. There would be a lot of that in his immediate future, the last time he could dress himself, the last time he could walk. I worried that he had entered a period when it would be One thing after another. Death by 1,000 cuts. A fall, a stroke, an accident with a grandfather clock. That's how it was with the other extremely old people I've known in my life. The woman across the road from us in Normandy, our next-door neighbor in London, Phyllis Diller. Late in her life, the two of us became friends. She lived in a mansion in Brentwood, and each time I'd visit her there, she'd be a bit less able. Her eyes wouldn't stop watering, or she couldn't get up from a chair. Phyllis was lucky in that she could remain at home and hire round-the-clock help. Lucky, too, that she was famous, a legend by any definition. All day disciples came to pay homage to her, and every night she went out. Thus she was spared the loneliness so many old people have to suffer. The last time I went to her house, I found her on the back patio. It was 1 in the afternoon, and she was drinking a martini. "Carla," she called to her assistant, "get David here something to drink. What would you like, sweetie? A vodka?" "Just some water," I said, settling in beside her. "Water with vodka in it?" "No, just the water." "Bring him a vodka tonic," Phyllis instructed, forgetting, I guess, that I don't drink. In Carla's absence, she pointed to 2 pigeons parading across her beautifully landscaped lawn. "All those 2 do," she said, lifting her glass with her blue-veined hand, the fingers as thin and brittle as twigs. "I mean, all they do is fuck." We were off somewhere when most of the turtles hatched, some 63 of them. We missed the 6 that clawed their way out early the following morning as well. Hugh's brother left with the boys on a Sunday, and a few hours later the final one burst forth. I was on a walk when it happened, and returned minutes after it had stumbled down the trench and into the ocean. "It was heartbreaking," he reported. He was standing in his bathing suit on the beach behind our house, one in a crowd of 50 or so. "What was so sad?" I asked. "I mean, he made it, right?" Hugh's voice cracked. "Yes, but he was just so alone." "I can't believe you missed it," he was saying, as we were going to bed that night. He just pulled his shirt off, and I took a moment to admire his tan. It was nothing he'd worked for, rather it just came, the result of all the hours he'd spent in the ocean, occasionally with the boys, but mainly on his own, swimming like some sort of creature, one moment on his back and the next on his stomach, turning like a chicken on a spit. He's done this since childhood, and as a result his shoulders are so broad I can barely get my arms around them. Still I try. He slips beneath the covers, and I cleave to him like a barnacle, thinking of all the couples I know who no longer share a bed. "He snores," the wife will tell me, or "I need my own space." I'd hate separate rooms, though a sleep apnea machine might be a deal breaker. Or incontinence. Definitely incontinence. I can't predict what's waiting for us, lurking on the other side of our late middle age, but I know it can't be good. Before returning to England, we drove back to Raleigh and ate lunch with my father, who had a biscuit-sized bandage on his ear and was relying on a walker that had his name and room number written on it in magic marker. "I didn't want to meet at Springmore. You told us you were Dave Chappelle." So Lisa and Bob drove him to a cafe we'd all agreed on. Watching from a distance as he slowly advanced toward the table, I was struck by how breakable he seemed. Still, his spirits were high, and he was engaging, funny even, especially when talking about Springmore and the way the staff will walk in whenever they want to. "It's a problem because I don't always feel like wearing clothes, if you catch my drift." "Sure," I said, thinking what's wrong with underpants at least. Kathy met us at the restaurant as well, and midway through our meal she told my father about the baby loggerheads she'd seen hatching a few days earlier on Emerald Isle. "Oh, right," my father said. "They've laid their eggs there for centuries. For even longer, I imagine. Eons." And the last one to pop out of the sand, she reported. The very last one. The Turtle Patrol people named Lou. Isn't that something? A more sentimental audience might have moved their hands to their hearts and cooed. Eyes might have misted, or filled with actual tears. Had someone named a human baby after my father, called it, say, Lou Sedaris Quitchoff, or better yet, Lou Harry Sedaris Quitchoff, my family might have shared a moment over our salads and sandwiches there at the Belted Goat. But this was an endangered turtle with only a tiny chance of living until the end of the week, and so it was more like naming a bar of soap after someone, if soap could paddle around briefly. "What can I tell you?" my father said, his voice soft and dry, like corn husks being rubbed together. "I'm notorious. I'm legendary. I'm a survivor." Thank you for listening to the end.